Edward V was King of England for 11 weeks, from the 9th of April to the 25th of June 1483, when he was apparently dethroned by his uncle, Richard III. He's the 13th Plantagenet King on our list. It's maybe not correct to describe his tenure as a reign, because in short, he never did, nor was he ever crowned. He's famous for being the son of King Edward IV, for inheriting the crown when he was just 12 years old, and for being one of the two princes in the Tower, along with his younger brother Richard, who had disappeared. Let's have a look at where Edward V sits in our timeline. He's here, inheriting the crown 540 years ago. When he was born in 1470, his father Edward IV had been king for around 9 years. Edward had been crowned after overthrowing the sitting king Henry VI in 1461. But in the weeks before Edward V's birth, powerful nobles had overthrown him and placed Henry VI back on the throne. At the time of his birth, his father had fled the kingdom, leaving the Queen behind to give birth to Edward V in hiding in the grounds of Westminster Abbey. As we explored in our previous video, Edward IV returned the following year, re-overthrew King Henry VI and declared himself king once again. He would reign until his death in 1483. It would be relatively easy to simply say Edward was made king and then he was overthrown and that was that. After all, he was just a child and his tenure was so short, so there really can't be that much to say, surely. This video will focus on events leading up to his mysterious disappearance and the impact that it had on historical events that came after. So how does a king go missing? Briefly, King Edward IV had sent his young son to live in Ludlow, where he was raised under the tutelage of his uncle, Earl Rivers. He was informed of his father's death in 1483, and, as the eldest son and heir, immediately inherited the title, becoming Edward V. He duly started his journey to London for his coronation, along with the Earl, his older half-brother Richard, his mother's son from a previous marriage, and his chamberlain, Thomas Vaughan. As the four made their way to the capital, Edward IV's younger brother Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, started making his way south from the north of England, which he controlled. Gloucester intercepted the royal party just outside of London, separated Edward V from Rivers, his half-brother and his chamberlain, and sent them north. The Duke then brought Edward V south and placed him in the Tower of London for his own protection. Then he had the 3 men he'd sent north executed and postponed the coronation. He then postponed the coronation a second time and placed Edward V's younger brother, the 10-year-old Richard, the Duke of York, in the Tower alongside him. Around 10 weeks into Edward V's reign, a dodgy theologian, Ralph Shah, stood up in St. Paul's Cathedral and delivered a sermon. In it, he revealed a shocking revelation. He claimed that the recently deceased King Edward IV had already been married to someone else when he'd married Edward V's mother, Elizabeth Woodville. That meant that Edward V was illegitimate, and if so, he was no longer entitled to be king. The sermon and rumours took hold, and suddenly England was without a king. Valiantly stepping in and saving the day, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother, declared himself king, and he was duly crowned Richard III. After that, Edward and his brother were seen less and less, and by the end of the year, it was widely accepted that they had disappeared, probably killed. Edward V may not be the only king in our timeline to have been murdered. He wasn't the first, and he certainly wasn't the last, but he is the only monarch whose fate remains a complete mystery to this day, and who consequently remains unburied. We can be certain that these events must have been quite a shock for the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. One minute she was married to the king, the next he's dead, and her son is king. Then, her sons are imprisoned, her eldest is declared illegitimate, and her scheming brother-in-law is having himself crowned king. Unsurprisingly, she was spurred on to take revenge. She did, and threw her support behind the man who would overthrow the apparently dastardly Richard III and claim the throne himself, Henry Tudor, or Henry VII as we know him. In our next video, we'll cover the life of Richard III and ask an intriguing question. Was he really a monster who had his nephews killed so that he could be crowned? Or was he a genuinely protective uncle, an innocent victim painted as a villain by Tudor propaganda?